Hi, everybody. Joanna here. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in late October and all of November. First one, Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny. This book takes place on a colony planet. Earth has long since been dead, and there is a group of men and women who are posing to be gods of the Hindu pantheon. And one man who's leading a rebellion against them, a man who goes by the name of Sam. I'm going to read the first paragraph because I think it'll give you a good sense of the flavor of this book. His followers called him Mahasamatman and said he was a god. He preferred to drop the Maha and the Atman, however, and call himself Sam. He never claimed to be a god, but then he never claimed not to be a god. I think you can right away get a sense of the tone and humor just from that very entrance. And this particular book does have excellent humor, it has excellent imagery. It weaves in some Buddhist philosophy. This particular book also has an interesting structure. So, chapter one takes place actually much later in the timeline of this book than when you pick up from chapter two on, and it does cover a large amount of time. So it was very helpful to learn that early on because I was a little confused when I went into chapter two. While I enjoyed it from the beginning, I have to say it took me a while to get into the flow of the story. And it wasn't until chapter four that I really loved what was happening here on the page. I think Zelazny has a way with words. I laughed, I gasped, I paused. So I really enjoyed my time with this book. And I'm looking forward to talking about this on my channel. I'll be hosting a discussion soon with Matt from Matt on Books and Philip Chase. That'll be up on my channel later this month, so keep an eye out for that. If you want to hear more, we will start spoiler free. Next up, I have Chokshi's The Last Tale of the Flower Bride. This book was kindly gifted to me from Isa from Fun Fantasy Books. So thank you so much, Isa. This is a beautiful book. And this is a book that is considered a dark, atmospheric fairy tale story standalone. We are dealing with two different perspectives in this story. It's told in first person narration from a bridegroom fairy tale scholar who ends up in this firework romance with this woman named Indigo. She promises to be with him forever, to marry him as long as he never pries into her past. And then the other perspective, the other alternating chapters are from Indigo's best friend in childhood, Azor. And it takes place earlier in the timeline when Indigo and Azor are teenage best friends. So you get Indigo's past through that perspective. I didn't realize that when I read the book, by the way. For some reason, I thought this was just going to be involving the romantic relationship between between the bridegroom and the flower bride. And so that was a little bit of a surprise. This book is also all about weaving in the darker aspects of fairy tale into the narrative and unfolding a mystery as you go along. There's a bit of a magical realism quality to this story. You get this dreamlike sense of things that are happening, and it's a little bit questionable at times what's magical and what's not. There were themes involving safety, finding safety in relationships, establishing boundaries or crossing boundaries rather, and or unhealthy boundaries, I should say, unhealthy relationships. The other one has to do with childhood trauma as it relates to those two themes as well. As far as my personal enjoyment, there were some interesting things in the story that kept me engaged for the most part. But there were a couple things that were maybe a little less desirable for me than others. One being the alternating perspective with the teenage timeline. I just didn't realize that was going to be in the book, that that was going to be the focus of the book. I just wasn't really as interested in the teenage storyline. I thought it was well done. It felt well depicted. It felt authentic to these characters and what they went through. And I think it did add dimension to the main protagonist that we're following, but it just wasn't the kind of story that I was wanting. And then the other thing, and by the way, that's my fault because it does say that in the description. For some reason, I just got hooked on this idea of the bridegroom and his storyline, which is the other main focus of the story. And while I was initially really interested in his perspective as he is a fairy tale scholar, I also found those parts, I found myself having conflicts with those parts because on the one hand, him being a fairy tale scholar, I thought it added an interesting meta perspective to the story because he's constantly talking about these attributes of fairy tale when this, in fact, is a fairy tale. But at the same time, those little insertions, they came across almost a little contrived. Fairy tales, they're bound in oaths and promises and whatever. I'm paraphrasing. That's not how she wrote, but It felt that way to me. It felt a little contrived. It just seemed a little bit effortful. It just didn't quite land. But otherwise, it still established a good sense of mood overall, like, the atmosphere was established in the story. I think that the themes did have some interesting angles to them given the pasts of these characters. So I hope those thoughts are helpful, and thank you again, Isa, for this beautiful book. Next up, Disgrace by Coetzee. This particular book is very disturbing. We are following a character named David, who's a white college professor in South Africa, and he's divorced. He has a situation at the beginning with a prostitute, an arrangement with a prostitute he meets once a week. And then later, he sets his eyes on a young female student in his romantics class. And then later on, he ends up having this interesting interaction with his daughter, who's a grown woman working on a farm. She sells her wares at the local farmers market. There are some interesting racial complexities that are tied into the story, as we are in South Africa, and it gets very disturbing very quickly and just keeps getting more and more disturbing. This book is told in first person narration, and David is an incredibly believable protagonist. He has delusions of grandeur. He romanticizes his own lechery, saying he's the servant of Eros, and he constantly references works of music and works of literature and poetry. Yet you see whether this self image holds up as he digs the hole deeper and deeper for himself. And then that's contrasted with some of the events involving his daughter. So this book is very layered, especially regarding the place, the setting, and again, the racial complexities involved. While this isn't related to the main larger beats of the story, there is a part of the story in which David is working at an animal clinic with his daughter's friend, and this person is euthanizing animals. So David is helping with this process. And as he's reflecting on these animals who are brought in to die, I think it's giving him a perspective of himself as well. I think it's tied into that theme and also tied into why you see dogs on the cover of this book quite a bit. Plus, his daughter boards dogs as well. So there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, it's really interesting the way that animals or the treatment of animals, whether they are taken in to be cared for or brought in to be euthanized, how that's related to self perception in this story, and again to some of the deeper themes in the story. I could not stop listening to this book. I listened to it on audiobook, and I listened to this alongside Jimmy from the Fantasy Network as he was reading this. He had this book on his patron wheel for the month, selected by Ben from Books with Genghis Khan. And I know a lot of people in Jimmy's Discord read this book too alongside him. I'm not in his Discord, but I really enjoyed the audiobook. But I would say do not read this book unless you want to be disturbed. Next up is Electric Forest by Tanith Lee. So this takes place on a futuristic planet called Indigo, where the government is controlling reproduction and in that way making sure to prevent any physical ailments and making sure that everyone is physically attractive. But every once in a while, someone is born biologically by accident, as is the case for our main character, Magdala, nicknamed Ugly. So here we have this character, Magdala, who is described as having crooked shoulders, an eye that's half shut, a leg that hobbles, one that lags, and she's considered a social outcast. People don't really want to go near her. She lives a very sad, conservative life, a very lonely, isolated existence. She does her job. She goes back to her apartment. Once a month, she goes to the cafeteria and sits in the dark corner where she can enjoy fresh food with her paycheck. And then she's approached by a man named Claudio, a very handsome scientist who claims he can make her beautiful. This book deals with beauty standards and self preservation at the beginning, and then things really evolve and unfold. And I can't really say much about the themes as the story progresses, but I will say that Tanith Lee has a way with words. Her prose is electric, as in the title. It's chromatic. I use that word very intentionally here. And yet she's able to compose these beautifully fluid descriptions that transition into short sentences and keep you in the grips of what's happening. She never loses the immediacy of the plot, and the stakes just continue to escalate as you go on. So I thought that this was so well executed, and I have to say that before I even got to the end, I was online looking for other books by Tanith Lee because I was so impressed with her writing in this book. It turned into something of a buddy read with my new friend Whitney from The Secret Sauce of Storycraft. fantastic sci-fi channel, and so I've been really enjoying her content and getting to know her, and I know she loved the book as well, so she and I had been going back and forth quite a bit about it. This book was such a pleasant surprise for me, and I did pick it up thanks to Bookpilled. He did a short little pitch for this book in his three-body problem video, and I highly recommend checking that out. He wasn't quite so high on the three-body problem, sorry for the fans to hear that, but he did have some really good reasons as to why he didn't connect with that book, which I haven't read. And then as soon as he talked about this book, I immediately picked up this book and downloaded it that day. So I'm so glad I got to this. I would recommend this visually. I did try to listen a little bit to the audiobook, which is free on Scribd, but I didn't really connect with the narrator for some reason. So I do recommend reading it visually, and it's fairly short. So most of you could probably finish this in a sitting or two. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of nonfiction books, and I've been on the fence about whether to talk about nonfiction books in my wrap ups, but I am going to this time. I didn't last time, but I'm going to this time because I think these two books would be of interest to you all. So the first one is Murakami's What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. And I have read one Murakami book before. I read The Wind Up Bird Chronicle a few years ago, and I had some mixed feelings about it, honestly. But I was curious about this book because I'm always curious about writing in general, even though I'm not an aspiring writer. I just enjoy hearing people talk about the craft of writing. And I am a runner. I was really into running for about 20 years and I've just recently slowed down. I still run a little bit here and there, but not nearly like I used to. But I found a lot of what he shared very interesting, how he made some comparisons between the two endeavors. So he talked about things such as talent, for example, which I think he would consider more innate to a person, but something you can't totally rely on. So he also talks about cultivating focus and cultivating endurance, how those apply to both the consistency of running every day and writing every day, doing something even if you don't feel like doing it, and while this sounds like a motivational type of book, of course, he doesn't go into any very specific techniques about writing or anything like that. That's not what the book is. I don't think he would consider himself a typical motivational type of person, meaning that he actually considers himself a very unpleasant person because he is so hard on himself. He's the type of person who will look in the mirror and count all his flaws, and I had a really interesting time with this book because I felt like as somebody who has been a runner for so many years, I could totally understand what he was talking about with some of the consistent patterns he's established in his life. I'm also someone, just as an off topic, I'm also someone who has meditated every single day for the last several years. So I can also relate to the establishment of having a habit or ritual that you do every single day, even if you don't really feel like doing it, just making it an automatic thing and the discipline behind that initially. But what I found really interesting too was also the constant self assessment he does. So he talked about how the questions he would ask himself when he's running are very similar to questions he asks himself as a writer, like how much can I push myself or how far should I push myself and how flexible should I be and to what extent and how confident should I be and how much should I doubt myself. So I loved that constant self-assessment, just being very dynamic in that regard while at the same time trying to be very consistent in other ways. And I got to the end of the book and I thought, okay, it's fine. I don't know that I got so much out of it. And then I went back and reflected on the book more. And it was really interesting because when I went back and reflected over the book some more, I realized that I feel like I have a lot in common with Murakami, or I felt like a sense of connection with him. It was very strange to realize that, but I'm not saying I'm exactly like him. I wish I were in some ways. In other ways, I'm kind of glad I'm not. But I think it was just interesting. It was an interesting view on discipline, on cultivating your art, your craft. So I'd recommend it if you just want a different perspective or just get that perspective because I think it's definitely valuable. Next one I'm going to talk about is one I would universally recommend to everyone except for a few people. I'll talk about them in a second. And that's Disfigured. This book is by Amanda Leduc. And this particular book talks about fairy tales, how they shape us, those formative stories that we're introduced to in our youth, especially Disney, and how disability is represented as sometimes a negative. Sometimes there is physiognomy involved, like attributing good characteristics with beautiful features, or even things such as a woman who is considered an old crone being the wicked witch in disguise, or the fatherly wizard figure having wisdom and sage like advice. So it tackles some of that as well, but this is so well researched. She did an amazing job of talking about the roots of certain fairy tales and talking about the implications, the ways, the messages that we take from them, the way that disability is magically resolved and how that does a disservice to people who are disabled in our communities. She also references A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. I am surprised, actually, thanks to Bookborn's videos, that people can get to 2023, be immersed in fantasy culture, and not be spoiled for that series. But just in case there are spoilers there, I don't know that there really are that much for the series, but just in case, maybe check the books out first or just be cautious when reading this about that. But I still think that everyone can get something valuable out of this book. I know I did quite a bit, and I did listen to the audiobook, but I knew I had to get the physical copy because there are certain passages I want to go back and reread, refamiliarize myself with. So I thought this was a very important read for me. And it was interesting to read this after, or listen to the audiobook, I should say, after having read Electric Forest, which does deal with disfigurement. So I highly recommend checking this out. Lastly, I'm just going to quickly talk about Pride and Prejudice because I just today finished the audiobook of this and I loved it. This was such a delightful romantic comedy. I don't know if I need to say much about what Pride and Prejudice is about. It involves social class dynamics, a love triangle, enemies to lovers, miscommunication, all the classic romantic tropes imaginable, but so clever in its execution, so brilliantly plotted. And the characters have so much dimension, which is brought out with these wonderful dynamics, incredible family dynamics between siblings, parents and children, aunts and uncles and cousins, and even friendships. And of course, the romance that blossoms was perfect. I am not much of a romance reader, but it would be hard for another romance book to top this one, especially a romantic comedy book, I should say. And this was brought to life all the more, I think, by the audiobook narrator. I started out with the free Audible audiobook of this and wasn't quite gelling with the narrator for some reason. So I went on Libby and I found one through my library with the narration by Kate Kelgren, and it was excellent. I loved Kate Kelgren's narration. It was just such clear, crisp prose, such great dialogue, beautiful settings. I thought that we captured a lot of the culture at the time. Of course, this is a time when it's not comfortable to be a woman in society. I mean, there's a lot at stake for you to marry into the right family, but it was likely realistic to that time. And so I think it gives you a good viewpoint into that time in England. I'm still processing as I just finished the book today. I should get my physical copy, which I just bought. This is my Penguin Drop Caps edition that I bought from Barnes& and Noble the other day because I just couldn't resist. I feel like I could go back and reread it, and I did tab a couple of places here and there. So, what a wonderful book, wonderfully delightful. I'm looking forward to reading more Jane Austen in the future. Can't believe I waited so long to get to Jane Austen. That concludes my wrap up. Please let me know in the comment section below if you've read any of these books or if you're planning to read any of these books. I would love to hear from you. And that's it for now. Have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.